They teased him for being quiet, until his name showed. He was the Reaper. Marcus Chen sat in the corner of the Galactic Military Academy's cafeteria, methodically eating his protein rations while the other cadets laughed and talked around him. The noise bounced off the metal walls of the massive space station that housed the most prestigious military training facility in known space. Representatives from dozens of species filled the room, their various languages creating a symphony of alien sounds that most humans found overwhelming. But Marcus didn't seem bothered by any of it. He simply ate in silence, occasionally glancing at the holographic tactical displays that floated above each table, showing real-time battle simulations from across the galaxy. "Look at the quiet human," sneered Vextar, a 7-foot-tall Krellian whose scales shimmered with an oily green sheen. His forearms gestured dramatically as he spoke to his friends. 3 months here, and I don't think I've heard him say more than 10 words. The group around Vextar laughed, their various alien features contorting with amusement. There was Zix, a crystalline being whose body chimed when he moved, and Thorak, a massive bear-like creature from the outer rim whose fur was permanently scorched from his homeworld's volcanic atmosphere. "Maybe he's broken," suggested Zix, his voice sounding like wind chimes in a storm. "I heard humans are supposed to be chatty creatures, always talking about their feelings and making emotional decisions." Marcus continued eating, seemingly unaware of their conversation. His dark eyes remained focused on his meal, though those who looked closely might have noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. The teasing had become a daily ritual. Marcus was one of only 12 humans in the academy, part of the first wave of Terran recruits since humanity had been grudgingly accepted into the Galactic Alliance 5 years ago. Most humans who made it to the academy were loud, brash, and eager to prove themselves worthy of standing alongside species that had been traveling the stars for millennia. Marcus was different. He attended every class, completed every assignment, and scored consistently in the top 10% of his cohort. But he did it all without fanfare, without boasting, and without the emotional outbursts that other species had come to expect from humans. "I bet he's scared," Thorak rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. "Humans are supposed to be warriors, but this one acts more like a frightened herb-eater from Plexus Prime." The comment drew more laughter from the surrounding tables. Even some of the other human cadets glanced over with embarrassed expressions, as if Marcus's quiet behavior reflected poorly on their entire species. Professor Kelmoth, an elderly Xanthari with 6 arms and compound eyes that missed nothing, observed the interaction from across the room. She had been teaching at the academy for over 2 centuries, and had seen thousands of cadets pass through these halls. Something about the quiet human intrigued her. His test scores were exceptional, particularly in tactical analysis and strategic planning. Yet he seemed to have no interest in the social dynamics that dominated academy life. As the lunch period ended, cadets began filing out to their afternoon classes. Marcus finished his meal, cleaned his tray with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else, and headed toward the Combat Simulation Center. The hallways of the academy were marvels of engineering, with gravity fields that adjusted for different species and atmospheric processors that maintained comfortable conditions for dozens of different physiologies. Holographic displays showed real-time updates from across the galaxy, including news from various fronts where the Galactic Alliance maintained peacekeeping forces. Marcus walked past a group of senior cadets who were discussing the latest developments in the Outer Rim conflicts. Pirates had been raiding shipping lanes, and several Alliance worlds had reported mysterious attacks on their defense installations. The raids were coordinated and professional, suggesting military training that went beyond typical pirate operations. "I heard they're calling in the Ghost Fleet," one of the seniors whispered. "Command must be getting desperate if they're activating those units." Marcus paused almost imperceptibly at the mention of the Ghost Fleet, but continued walking before anyone noticed his reaction. The Combat Simulation Center was a massive dome filled with holographic projectors capable of creating incredibly realistic battle scenarios. Today's exercise involved tactical command simulations, where cadets would be placed in charge of virtual fleets and required to complete various missions. Instructor Valthek, a veteran Kandorian warrior whose species was known for their tactical brilliance, stood before the assembled cadets. His 4 legs were positioned in the traditional stance of authority, and his translator collar rendered his clicking speech into standard galactic. "Today you will face scenarios based on real conflicts from our recent history," Valthek announced. "You will be evaluated not just on your success or failure, but on your decision-making process, resource management, and ability to adapt to changing circumstances." The cadets were divided into groups and assigned to individual simulation pods. Marcus found himself alone in Pod 7, surrounded by holographic displays that showed a detailed star map of the Kepler sector. His mission briefing appeared before him. A convoy of civilian transports was under attack by unknown raiders, and he had been given command of a small patrol fleet to investigate and respond. As the simulation began, Marcus's demeanor shifted subtly. His movements became more focused, his eyes tracking multiple displays simultaneously as he absorbed tactical information at an incredible rate. Within minutes, he had analyzed the attack patterns, identified the most likely escape routes, and began deploying his forces with surgical precision. In the observation booth above the simulation floor, Professor Kelmoth and Instructor Valthek watched the various scenarios unfold. Most cadets were struggling with the complexity of commanding multiple ships while dealing with incomplete information and time pressure. "The Terran in Pod 7 is interesting," Valthek observed. His clicking translated with a note of curiosity. "His approach is unlike anything I've seen from his species." On the displays, Marcus's fleet moved with coordinated efficiency. Rather than charging directly at the raiders, he had positioned his ships to cut off their escape routes while using long-range sensors to gather intelligence. When he finally engaged, it was with overwhelming force applied at precisely the right moment. The simulation ended with Marcus achieving a complete tactical victory in record time, having saved all civilian transports while capturing several raiders for interrogation. His resource usage was minimal, and his casualty rate was 0. As the cadets emerged from their pods, there was excited chatter about the various scenarios and how each had handled their missions. Vextar and his friends had completed their simulations with mixed results, managing to save most of their objectives but at significant cost in ships and personnel. "Lucky guess," Vextar muttered when he saw Marcus's perfect score displayed on the main board. "Probably got an easy scenario." But Professor Kelmoth made a note in her personal files about the quiet human cadet. She had reviewed all the scenarios, and Marcus had been given one of the most difficult situations. His performance suggested a level of tactical thinking that went far beyond what should be possible for someone his age. As the cadets filed out of the simulation center, Marcus remained silent, showing no reaction to his exceptional performance. He simply gathered his materials and headed to his next class, leaving others to wonder about the mysterious human who spoke little but achieved so much. They teased him for being quiet, until his name showed. He was the Reaper. The Academy's night cycle brought a different atmosphere to the massive station. The main lights dimmed to simulate planetary darkness, and the corridors took on an almost ethereal quality as emergency lighting cast long shadows between the structural supports. Most cadets use this time for study, recreation, or sleep, depending on their species' biological requirements. Marcus Chen made his way through the quieter sections of the Academy, heading toward the restricted archives. His access credentials, earned through his exceptional academic performance, allowed him entry to historical databases that most cadets never saw. Tonight he had a specific purpose in mind. The archive chamber was vast and silent, filled with quantum storage units that contained the military history of dozens of civilizations. Holographic interfaces floated at workstations throughout the room, waiting for users to access the billions of records stored within the system. Marcus approached a terminal and began his search. He wasn't looking for general military history or famous battles that every cadet studied. Instead, he accessed a series of classified files related to human military operations during the First Contact Wars, the violent period when humanity had first encountered the galactic community 15 years ago. The files made for grim reading. Humanity's introduction to galactic politics had been through conflict, not diplomacy. A hegemony exploratory fleet had discovered Earth and immediately classified humans as a primitive but aggressive species, suitable for subjugation and resource extraction. The war that followed had lasted 3 years and cost millions of lives on both sides. What most cadets didn't know, and what Marcus was now reading, was how that war had really ended. The official history spoke of diplomatic negotiations and mutual recognition of sovereignty. The classified files told a different story. Marcus scrolled through after-action reports from something called Operation Silent Thunder. The documents described a series of surgical strikes against hegemony command vessels, carried out by small human units that seemed to appear and disappear without warning. Hegemony forces had begun calling the attackers Deathwalkers in their own language, beings who brought destruction and then vanished like ghosts. The operation had been so effective that the hegemony's war council had sued for peace rather than face continued losses of their command structure. But the files also revealed something else. Operation Silent Thunder had been carried out by a single human operative, working alone behind enemy lines for over a year. The operative's codename had been Reaper. Marcus closed the files and sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Around him, the archive chamber hummed with the quiet sounds of quantum processors and environmental systems. He remained motionless for several minutes, lost in thought. The next morning brought another day of classes and training exercises. In advanced xenobiology, Professor Yiltash, a slug-like Molarian with expertise in cross-species physiology, was discussing the various physical adaptations that different species had developed for warfare. The Krellians, she said, her translated voice carrying a slight wet quality, developed enhanced musculature and redundant organ systems that make them nearly impossible to disable in close combat. The Zenthari evolved their additional limbs to allow for complex manipulation of multiple weapon systems simultaneously. Vexitar preened at the mention of his species' combat prowess, flexing his forearms in an obvious display. And humans, Professor Yiltash continued, developed what many consider the most dangerous military adaptation of all, psychological resilience combined with tactical unpredictability. Where other species rely on superior technology or physical advantages, humans excel at adapting their strategies to overcome seemingly impossible odds. That's just propaganda, scoffed Thorak. Humans are emotionally unstable and technologically primitive. The only reason they won their independence was luck and the Alliance's intervention. Several other cadets murmured agreement while the few humans in the class looked uncomfortable. Marcus, as usual, showed no reaction to the discussion. Professor Yiltash's eye stalks swiveled toward Thorak. I would encourage you to examine the historical records more carefully, Cadet Thorak. The human victory over the hegemony was achieved through strategic brilliance, not luck. Their military doctrine of asymmetric warfare proved remarkably effective against conventional galactic tactics. After class, Marcus made his way to the Academy's communications center. His access to advanced systems allowed him to send and receive encrypted messages through the galactic network, though such communications were typically monitored by Academy security. Today, however, Marcus used his credentials to access a hidden partition within the system, one that required biometric verification beyond what any cadet should possess. His palm print and retinal scan activated a communication channel that existed outside normal Academy protocols. A holographic figure materialized in the secure booth. The image was distorted for security purposes, showing only a silhouette against a backdrop of static. Status report, the figure said without preamble. Assignment proceeding as planned, Marcus replied, his voice carrying a professional tone that none of his fellow cadets had ever heard. Academic performance is within acceptable parameters. Cover identity remains intact. Any complications? Social integration is minimal, but that was expected. The other cadets view me as an oddity, which serves our purposes. Faculty attention is beginning to increase due to tactical performance scores. The figure nodded. Recent intelligence suggests our timeline may be accelerating. Hegemony forces have been detected in 3 outer rim systems. They're testing Alliance response capabilities. Marcus's expression hardened slightly. Do we have confirmation of hegemony involvement in the pirate raids? Affirmative. Weapon signatures and tactical patterns match archive data from the First Contact Wars. They're building toward something larger. Orders? Continue your assignment. Maintain cover at all costs. We may need to activate contingency protocols sooner than anticipated. The communication ended, leaving Marcus alone in the booth. He sat silently for several minutes before emerging and returning to the normal routine of Academy life. Later that day, during combat training exercises, Instructor Vaktul put the cadets through close-quarters combat scenarios. The Ragonian veteran's 6 limbs moved with practiced efficiency, as he demonstrated techniques that could disable opponents twice his size. Combat is not about strength or speed alone, Vaktul explained, his translated speech carrying the growling undertones of his species. It is about understanding your opponent's weaknesses and exploiting them with maximum efficiency. The cadets were paired off for sparring matches. Vextar, confident in his species' natural combat advantages, immediately challenged one of the human cadets to demonstrate Krellian superiority. The match ended quickly with the human cadet on the ground and Vextar standing triumphant. "Your turn, Quiet One," Vextar called to Marcus, his forearms spread in a gesture of challenge. "Let's see if you can do better than your fellow human." Marcus looked up from the equipment he had been checking, his dark eyes meeting Vextar's reptilian gaze. For a moment something flickered in Marcus's expression, something that made several nearby cadets take an unconscious step backward. "I would prefer not to," Marcus said simply. The response drew laughter from Vextar's friends and disappointed looks from the other humans. Even Instructor Vaktul seemed puzzled by Marcus's reluctance to engage. "Afraid you'll embarrass yourself?" Thorak rumbled from the sidelines. Marcus continued his equipment check, apparently ignoring the taunts. But those watching closely might have noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hands moved with unconscious precision as he handled the training weapons. "Perhaps another time," Marcus said, his voice carrying no emotion. Vextar sneered but didn't press the issue, apparently satisfied that he had demonstrated human cowardice to the assembled cadets. The training session continued with other matches, but several instructors found themselves watching the quiet human with renewed interest. Professor Kelmoth, who had been observing from the viewing gallery above the training floor, made another note in her personal files. Marcus's refusal to fight wasn't born of fear or inadequacy. If anything, his body language suggested the opposite. A coiled readiness that spoke of training far beyond what any cadet should possess. As the day ended and cadets returned to their quarters, Marcus walked alone through the academy corridors. Behind him, whispered conversations continued among his classmates, most focused on his perceived weakness and unwillingness to defend human honor. None of them noticed the way Marcus moved through the shadows between lighting panels, or how his eyes continuously scanned for potential threats and escape routes. None of them recognized the habits of someone who had been trained to survive in hostile territory. In his private quarters, Marcus performed his nightly routine with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else. But tonight he also activated a small device hidden within his personal effects, a scanner that checked his room for surveillance equipment. They teased him for being quiet until his name showed. He was the Reaper. The emergency klaxons that woke the academy at 0347 station time were not part of any scheduled drill. Marcus was instantly alert, his training kicking in as he processed the specific pattern of the alarm signals. This was a genuine crisis alert, the kind that meant real danger was approaching the academy station. Cadets stumbled from their quarters in various states of dress and confusion. The corridor lighting had shifted to red emergency illumination, and automated voices in a dozen languages announced the activation of defense protocols. Through the massive viewports that lined the station's outer corridors, the stars seemed different somehow, their familiar patterns altered by ships moving in the darkness. "All cadets report to designated emergency stations," Professor Kelmoth's voice echoed through the communication system. "This is not a drill." Repeat, "This is not a drill." Marcus moved through the chaos with purposeful calm, heading not toward the emergency stations where other cadets were gathering, but toward one of the academy's restricted command centers. His access credentials, which should not have worked during a security lockdown, opened sealed doors without resistance. The command center buzzed with activity as senior staff coordinated the academy's defenses. Admiral Thexvar, the station commander, stood before a massive holographic display showing the local star system. Red indicators marked the positions of unknown vessels that had emerged from hyperspace less than an hour ago. 18 ships, reported Commander Zilneth, her Altarian tentacles dancing over multiple control surfaces simultaneously. Configuration matches hegemony assault patterns from the First Contact Wars. They're demanding our surrender. Admiral Thexvar's crest flared with anger. The hegemony was disbanded after the war. This must be a remnant faction. "Sir," Another officer called out. "We're receiving detailed scans of their vessels. These aren't retrofitted ships or surplus equipment. This is current-generation hegemony technology. Someone has been rebuilding their fleet." Marcus observed from the shadows near the chamber's entrance, his presence unnoticed in the controlled chaos. The tactical situation was clear. The Academy station was heavily shielded and armed, but primarily designed for training exercises, not full-scale military engagement. Against 18 assault vessels, their chances of survival were minimal. "Send word to Alliance Command," Admiral Thexvar ordered. "Request immediate military assistance. Sir, communications are being jammed. Long-range transmissions are not getting through." The Admiral's expression grew grim. The Academy housed over 3,000 cadets and staff from dozens of species, representing the future military leadership of the Galactic Alliance. If the station fell, it would be both a strategic and symbolic victory for humanity's former enemies. Marcus slipped away from the command center and made his way to a different section of the station. The communications jamming that prevented calls for help also provided opportunities for those who knew how to exploit such situations. In a maintenance section rarely visited by Academy personnel, Marcus accessed a hidden panel and activated equipment that definitely did not appear on any official station schematics. Within minutes, he had established a secure channel through the jamming field using frequencies and encryption protocols that were classified far above cadet level. "Emergency authentication, Omega-77 Reaper." Marcus spoke into the hidden transmitter. "Request immediate activation of Protocol 13. The response came within seconds. "Authentication confirmed. Protocol 13 authorized. Assets are standing by for deployment." "Negative," Marcus replied. "Maintain standby status. I will handle initial reconnaissance. Be prepared to implement full tactical response if required." Marcus closed the communication channel and made his way back toward the cadet quarters. By now, the emergency stations were crowded with confused and frightened young beings from across the galaxy. Many had never experienced real danger, having lived their entire lives under the protection of Alliance peace. Vexitar was trying to organize a group of cadets from his own species, his forearms gesturing as he spoke in rapid Krellian. "We should prepare to fight," he was saying. "If they board the station, we can show them that future Alliance officers are not helpless prey." "With what weapons?" demanded Zix, his crystalline form chiming with agitation. "We have training equipment and simulators. They have warships. Better to die fighting than cowering in hiding," Thorak rumbled, though his massive frame betrayed nervousness despite his brave words. Marcus found an empty corner and activated his personal communicator, using Academy frequencies that would appear routine to any monitoring systems. "Cadet Chen to Command Center," he said. "Request permission to assist with technical systems analysis." Professor Kelmoth's voice responded. "Denied, Cadet Chen. All cadets are to remain at emergency stations until further notice." But Marcus was already moving, using service corridors and maintenance passages that most cadets didn't know existed. His movements were silent and efficient, covering ground quickly while avoiding the main thoroughfares where Academy security was directing personnel. The station's sensor arrays were located on the outer hull, protected by heavily armored chambers but accessible through maintenance tunnels. Marcus reached the primary sensor control room and began analyzing the attacking force with equipment far more sophisticated than standard Academy systems. What he found was troubling. The 18 ships were indeed hegemony design, but their technology showed improvements that shouldn't have been possible. Someone had been developing advanced weapons and defense systems in secret, preparing for a return to open warfare. More concerning was the tactical formation the ships had adopted. This wasn't a standard assault pattern from the hegemony military manual. It was an adaptive formation, one that suggested the enemy commander had studied Alliance defensive doctrines and developed countermeasures. Marcus's analysis was interrupted by a new development on the sensors. 3 of the hegemony ships were launching boarding pods, small armored vessels designed to breach station hulls and deliver assault troops directly into target facilities. The pods would reach the Academy in less than 20 minutes. Marcus activated another hidden communication channel, this one connecting him directly to the station's defense grid. Using authorization codes that should not have existed in any cadet's possession, he began rerouting power and adjusting defensive systems. "Unknown operator, identify yourself." came a challenge from the station's security center. Special Authorization Sigma Black 17, Marcus replied. Implementing emergency defensive protocols. There was a pause, then. Authorization confirmed. You have full system access. Marcus's fingers moved across the control interfaces with practiced efficiency. The Academy's defensive weapons were powerful, but had been configured for training exercises, not combat. Within minutes, he had recalibrated targeting systems, optimized power distribution, and activated weapon systems that had been dormant since the station's construction. The first boarding pod disintegrated under focused laser fire before it could reach the station's hull. The second pod's trajectory was altered by precisely timed gravity pulse generators, sending it tumbling harmlessly into space. The third pod managed to attach to the station's outer hull, but found itself facing blast doors that had been sealed and reinforced beyond standard specifications. In the command center, Admiral Thexvar stared at his tactical displays in amazement. Who authorized the activation of the enhanced defense grid? He demanded. Unknown, sir, Commander Zilneth replied. The commands are coming from within the station, but the authorization codes are classified above our access level. Sir, another officer called out. The attacking ships are changing formation. They appear to be retreating. On the main display, the hegemony vessels were indeed pulling back, moving away from the Academy station in what appeared to be an organized withdrawal rather than a chaotic retreat. Marcus watched the enemy departure from the sensor control room, his expression grim. This had been a probe, not a serious assault. The enemy had tested the Academy's defenses and gathered intelligence about Alliance capabilities. The fact that they were withdrawing meant they had learned what they came to learn, but Marcus had learned something too. The hegemony's return was not the work of scattered remnants or rogue commanders. This was an organized military force with advanced technology and detailed intelligence about Alliance installations. The war that everyone thought had ended 15 years ago was about to begin again as emergency alerts throughout the station began to stand down. Marcus made his way back toward the cadet quarters through the same maintenance passages he had used earlier. By the time he reached the emergency station where his fellow cadets were gathered, he appeared to be just another relieved student who had weathered his first real crisis. Did you hear? Vextar was saying excitedly to anyone who would listen. The station's defense systems activated automatically, some kind of advanced artificial intelligence that protected us. I heard it was a classified Alliance defense protocol. Zix chimed in. Something left over from the first contact wars. Marcus said nothing, taking his place among the other cadets as if he had been there throughout the entire crisis. But Professor Kelmoth, who had been watching the crowd for signs of how different cadets had handled their first real emergency, noticed that Marcus showed none of the residual stress or excitement that marked the others. Instead, he looked like someone who had just finished a job. As the Academy began returning to normal operations, very few people knew that the quiet human cadet who sat alone in the cafeteria had just saved over 3,000 lives. Even fewer knew that the same cadet was already planning for the larger war that was coming. And absolutely no one suspected that Marcus Chen had once been the most feared operative in human military history. The ghost who had ended the first contact wars with precision strikes that had become legend among those who fought in the shadows between the stars. Marcus said nothing, taking his place among the other cadets as if he had been there throughout the entire crisis. But Professor Kelmoth, who had been watching the crowd for signs of how different cadets had handled their first real emergency, noticed that Marcus showed none of the residual stress or excitement that marked the others. Instead, he looked like someone who had just finished a job. As the Academy began returning to normal operations, very few people knew that the quiet human cadet who sat alone in the cafeteria had just saved over 3,000 lives. Even fewer knew that the same cadet was already planning for the larger war that was coming. And absolutely no one suspected that Marcus Chen had once been the most feared operative in human military history. The ghost who had ended the first contact wars with precision strikes that had become legend among those who fought in the shadows between the stars. They teased him for being quiet, until his name showed. He was the Reaper 3 weeks after the hegemony probe. Life at the Galactic Military Academy had settled into an uneasy routine. Security protocols remained elevated, and additional Alliance warships patrolled the system. But for most cadets, the crisis had become just another story to tell in letters home. Marcus continued his classes and training exercises with the same quiet efficiency that had marked his time at the academy. But those who observed carefully might have noticed subtle changes in his behavior. He spent more time in the communications center, made frequent visits to the tactical simulation chambers during off hours, and could often be found studying star charts in the navigation library. Professor Kelmoth had begun conducting her own quiet investigation into the mysterious human cadet. His academic records were exemplary, but surprisingly sparse, containing only the basic information required for academy admission. His psychological evaluations were equally unrevealing, showing a stable but unusually reserved personality, with exceptional spatial reasoning and tactical thinking abilities. What troubled her most was what the records didn't contain. There were no childhood education records, no family references, and no documented history prior to his application to the academy. For a species as bureaucratic as humans were supposed to be, the absence of paperwork was deeply suspicious. The answer to her questions came from an unexpected source during a routine xenobiology lecture. Professor Yiltash was discussing adaptive camouflage techniques used by various species when she mentioned a peculiar case study. The most effective camouflage, she explained, her Malarian body undulating as she spoke, is not always physical concealment. Sometimes the best way to hide is to become so unremarkable that observers see you but immediately forget your presence. Vextar, who had been paying minimal attention to the lecture, suddenly straightened. Like that human, he said, pointing at Marcus. I see him every day, but if you asked me to describe him 5 minutes later, I probably couldn't. The comment was meant as another casual insult, but it had an unexpected effect on Professor Kelmoth. Suddenly, pieces of a puzzle began falling into place. Marcus wasn't just naturally quiet or socially awkward. He was deliberately cultivating an unremarkable presence, using psychological techniques to make himself forgettable. After class, Professor Kelmoth made her way to her private office and activated a secure terminal connected to the Alliance Intelligence Network. Her credentials as a senior academy instructor gave her access to certain classified databases, though she rarely used such privileges. Today was different. She began searching for any records connected to Marcus Chen, using advanced search algorithms that could trace connections across multiple databases and star systems. What she found made her 6 eyes widen in shock. The name Marcus Chen appeared in exactly one classified file, buried deep within Alliance intelligence archives, and marked with security restrictions that should have made it invisible to Academy personnel. The file was labeled Operation Silent Thunder, Post-Action Personnel Review. Professor Kelmoth's multiple hearts began beating faster as she read the heavily redacted document. Operation Silent Thunder had been humanity's most classified military action during the First Contact Wars, a series of surgical strikes that had crippled hegemony command structures and forced their surrender. The operation had been carried out by a single human operative working behind enemy lines. The operative's name in the file was listed as Agent 17, but a single, unredacted line at the bottom of the document read, Operative Civilian Identity, Marcus Chen. Recommended for permanent reassignment following mission completion. Professor Kelmoth sat back in her chair, her mind reeling from the implications. The quiet cadet who sat in her classes every day, the one his fellow students teased for being weak and unremarkable, was possibly the most dangerous individual on the station. Her contemplation was interrupted by an urgent communication alert. Academy security was requesting her immediate presence in the command center for a matter of utmost importance regarding cadet welfare. When Professor Kelmoth arrived at the command center, she found Admiral Thexavar and his senior staff gathered around a holographic display showing real-time intelligence feeds from across the galaxy. The news was uniformly grim. 17 Alliance installations have been attacked in the past 72 hours, Admiral Thexavar reported. Military bases, research facilities, and communication relays. The attacks show perfect coordination and detailed knowledge of our defensive capabilities. Commander Zilneth manipulated the display to show attack patterns and timelines. The targets were selected for maximum strategic impact with minimal defensive response. Someone provided the attackers with current intelligence about our military infrastructure. Do we have confirmation that these are hegemony forces? Professor Kelmoth asked. though she already suspected the answer. Affirmative, the Admiral replied. Ship signatures and weapon patterns match the vessels that probed our defenses 3 weeks ago. But there's something else. Intelligence reports suggest these attacks are preliminary strikes, designed to weaken our response capabilities before a larger offensive. The implications were staggering. If the hegemony had rebuilt their military to the point where they could launch coordinated strikes across multiple star systems, the Alliance faced a threat that could dwarf the original First Contact wars. What are our response options? Professor Kelmoth asked. Admiral Thexvar's expression was grim. Limited. Most of our rapid response fleets are committed to protecting core worlds and major installations. The Academy is technically a low-priority target in a general war scenario. Sir, Commander Zilneth interrupted, we're receiving an urgent transmission from Alliance Command. Priority Alpha encryption. The main display shifted to show a holographic figure that Professor Kelmoth recognized as Admiral Sarah Harrison, one of the highest-ranking officers in Alliance Fleet Command. Her expression was deadly serious. Admiral Thexvar, she began without preamble, we have confirmed intelligence that your Academy station is a primary target for the next wave of hegemony attacks. They believe that eliminating the future leadership of Alliance forces will cripple our long-term military capabilities. The command center fell silent as the implications sank in. An attack on the Academy would not just be militarily significant, but would represent a massacre of young beings from dozens of species, all of whom represented the hope for continued galactic peace. Estimated time to arrival of attacking forces, Admiral Thexvar asked. 18 hours, Admiral Harrison replied. We're dispatching what reinforcements we can, but they won't arrive for at least 36 hours. You'll have to hold position with current resources. After the communication ended, the command staff began immediate preparations for siege conditions. The Academy's defensive systems, already enhanced following the previous probe, were brought to full combat readiness. Emergency supplies were distributed throughout the station, and all non-essential personnel were moved to the most protected areas. Professor Kelmoth found herself thinking about the classified file she had discovered. If Marcus Chen really was Agent 17, the operative who had single-handedly ended the First Contact wars, then the Academy had a strategic asset that could significantly impact their survival chances. But approaching him would mean revealing that she had accessed classified information and potentially exposing his cover. The decision was complicated by the fact that she wasn't entirely certain of his true identity, and making accusations based on fragmentary evidence could have serious consequences. Her dilemma was resolved when Marcus appeared at the command center, using the same mysterious access, credentials that had allowed him to coordinate the station's defenses during the previous attack. I have information that may be relevant to our defensive planning, he said simply, his quiet voice somehow cutting through the controlled chaos of preparation. Admiral Thexvar looked up from tactical displays. Cadet Chen, you should be with the other students in the secured areas. With respect, sir, my recommendations during the previous attack proved effective. I believe I can contribute to our defensive efforts. Professor Kelmoth watched the exchange with growing certainty. This was not the behavior of a typical cadet. No matter how talented, Marcus was speaking with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, even if that command had been exercised in the shadows. What information do you have? Admiral Thexvar asked. Marcus approached the main tactical display and began highlighting specific areas of the station's structure. The hegemony will likely use the same boarding pod tactics they employed previously, but in greater numbers. However, their pods have a specific vulnerability in their magnetic coupling systems. If we modify our hull polarity in these sections, we can prevent successful attachment. The suggestions were technically sophisticated and tactically sound. More importantly, they demonstrated detailed knowledge of hegemony technology that went beyond anything taught in academy classes. How do you know about hegemony boarding pod specifications? Commander Zilneth asked suspiciously. Marcus met her gaze steadily. I've studied the historical records thoroughly. The First Contact wars generated extensive technical intelligence about enemy capabilities. It was a plausible explanation, but Professor Kelmoth noticed that Marcus had not actually answered the question. Instead, he had deflected it in a way that suggested experience with interrogation techniques. As preparations for the coming battle continued, Marcus quietly integrated himself into the defensive planning process. His suggestions were consistently valuable, his technical knowledge was impressive, and his tactical thinking was remarkably sophisticated for someone his age. But Professor Kelmoth was beginning to suspect that Marcus Chen was not actually his age at all. Or rather, that the quiet cadet who attended her classes was a carefully constructed identity, worn by someone much older and far more dangerous than he appeared. The question was whether that dangerous someone was on their side, or if the Academy was about to face threats from within as well as without. As the 18-hour countdown continued, Professor Kelmoth decided that some questions were too important to leave unanswered, regardless of the potential consequences of asking them. They teased him for being quiet, until his name showed he was the Reaper Professor. Kelmoth found Marcus in the Academy's observation deck, standing alone before the massive transparent aluminum windows that offered a panoramic view of the starfield beyond. The deck was normally a popular gathering place for cadets, but with the impending attack, most students had been moved to more secure areas of the station. Marcus stood perfectly still, his dark eyes focused on something in the distance that only he could see. To a casual observer, he might have appeared to be a nervous cadet seeking solitude before battle. But Professor Kelmoth noticed the way he positioned himself with clear lines of sight to all entrances, and how his reflection in the window allowed him to monitor the corridor behind him. "The stars look different when you know danger is coming," she said, approaching slowly to avoid startling him. Marcus turned slightly, acknowledging her presence without appearing surprised by her arrival. "They look the same to me," he replied. "Stars don't change. Only our perspective does." Professor Kelmoth moved to stand beside him at the window. Through the transparent barrier, the distant pinpricks of light seemed peaceful and eternal, offering no hint of the violence that was approaching through the darkness between them. "I've been researching historical records," she said carefully, trying to understand how the First Contact Wars really ended. The official histories are remarkably vague about the final months of the conflict. Marcus remained silent, but she noticed a slight tension in his shoulders. "What I find interesting," Professor Kelmoth continued, "is how quickly the hegemony's command structure collapsed. One day they were winning the war, advancing on multiple fronts, and the next they were suing for peace. Official reports credit diplomatic breakthroughs and strategic alliance victories, but the timeline doesn't quite make sense. Wars end when one side loses the will to continue fighting," Marcus said quietly. "Sometimes that happens quickly. Yes, but usually there are clear precipitating events. Major battles, economic collapse, political upheaval. The hegemony's surrender seems to have been triggered by something else entirely, something that made their leadership more afraid of continuing the war than of accepting defeat." Marcus turned to face her directly for the first time. His dark eyes held an intensity that she had never seen during his time as a cadet, and for a moment she glimpsed something that made her understand why the hegemony might have chosen surrender over continued fighting. "Professor," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of warning, "some knowledge is dangerous to possess, especially in times like these." "I think," Professor Kelmoth replied, "that dangerous times require dangerous knowledge, and dangerous people." They stood in silence for several minutes, each evaluating the other. Finally, Marcus spoke again. "What exactly do you think you know?" "I know that Marcus Chen is listed in Alliance intelligence files as Agent 17 from Operation Silent Thunder. I know that Agent 17 was credited with ending the First Contact Wars through actions that remain classified at the highest levels. And I know that you are far more than you appear to be." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the starfield beyond the window. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to age him years in the space of a few words. "Agent 17 died at the end of the war," he said. "Marcus Chen is just a cadet trying to finish his education in peace. Is that what you tell yourself?" Professor Kelmoth asked gently. "Or is that what you were told to tell yourself?" The question seemed to hit something deep within Marcus. His carefully maintained composure flickered, and for just a moment, Professor Kelmoth saw through the mask he had been wearing. "They promised me a normal life," Marcus said, so quietly that she had to strain to hear him. "Complete the mission, save humanity, and then disappear into obscurity. New identity, new history, a chance to be just another person in a universe at peace. But the universe isn't at peace. Professor Kelmoth observed. And you can't really disappear, can you? Not when you're the only one who knows how to fight the kind of war that's coming. Marcus turned away from the window and began walking toward the corridor. Professor Kelmoth followed, sensing that their conversation was approaching a crucial moment. You don't understand what they made me into, Marcus said as they walked. The things I did during the war, the people I killed, the choices I had to make. Agent 17 wasn't a hero. He was a weapon pointed at the enemy and fired until the threat was eliminated. And now the threat has returned. Yes, Marcus said simply, and they think they can just activate me again, like a piece of equipment taken out of storage. They had reached a junction in the corridor where their paths would diverge. Professor Kelmoth toward the faculty quarters, Marcus toward the secured areas where cadets were sheltering. But instead of separating, they both stopped. The Academy will fall if we face this attack with conventional defenses, Professor Kelmoth said. We both know that. Admiral Thexvar is a competent officer, but he's never faced an enemy like the hegemony. None of our current commanders have. Marcus looked down the corridor toward where 3,000 young beings waited in fear for an attack they barely understood. When he spoke, his voice carried a resignation that Professor Kelmoth found more frightening than anger would have been. The Academy won't fall, he said. I won't let it. What will you do? Marcus was quiet for so long that Professor Kelmoth thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried the chill of absolute certainty. What I was made to do. Before Professor Kelmoth could respond, emergency klaxons began sounding throughout the station. The attack was beginning early. Marcus immediately shed the last pretense of being an ordinary cadet. His movements became fluid and purposeful as he headed not toward the emergency stations, but toward a section of the Academy that Professor Kelmoth hadn't even known existed. Where are you going? She called after him. To get my equipment, Marcus replied without looking back. Tell Admiral Thexvar to implement Defensive Plan Gamma 7 and wait for my signal. What signal? But Marcus had already disappeared into a maintenance corridor that led toward the Academy's classified levels. Professor Kelmoth stood alone in the hallway, listening to the sound of battle stations activating throughout the massive station. In the command center, Admiral Thexvar watched his tactical displays as 26 hegemony vessels dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. This force was significantly larger than the probe they had faced 3 weeks earlier, and their formation suggested serious intent rather than reconnaissance. Time to weapons range? He asked. 4 hours at current approach velocity, Commander Zilneth replied. But sir, they're launching something. Multiple small craft, moving much faster than the main fleet. The tactical display highlighted dozens of objects accelerating away from the hegemony ships. These weren't the boarding pods they had encountered before, but something new. Missile boats, Admiral Thexvar realized. They're going to saturate our defenses with long-range strikes before sending in the main assault force. The Academy's defensive systems were formidable, but they had been designed to repel boarding actions and direct assaults, not massed missile attacks from multiple vectors. Against this kind of coordinated barrage, their chances of survival were rapidly approaching zero. As if the situation weren't desperate enough, long-range sensors detected additional hegemony ships jumping into nearby systems. This wasn't just an attack on the Academy. It was the beginning of a full-scale military campaign to retake territory that the Alliance had considered secure. Professor Kelmoth arrived at the command center and delivered Marcus's message about Defensive Plan Gamma 7. Admiral Thexvar's expression showed confusion. We don't have a Defensive Plan Gamma 7, he said. Who gave you this message? Before Professor Kelmoth could answer, the Academy's defensive systems began activating in patterns that none of the command staff had authorized. Weapon systems that had been dormant since the station's construction came online. Sensor arrays reconfigured themselves for maximum tactical effectiveness, and the station's power grid shifted into a configuration that boosted defensive capabilities by 30%. Who is controlling our systems? Admiral Thexvar demanded. His answer came when Marcus's voice spoke from the command center's communication system, though no one could see him on any internal sensors. This is Agent 17, the voice said, carrying an authority that made even the Admiral pause. I am assuming tactical command of Academy defenses under Alliance Emergency Protocol 77 Alpha. All personnel are to maintain current positions and await further instructions. Admiral Thexvar looked at Professor Kelmoth with an expression that demanded explanations. But before she could speak, Marcus's voice continued. Admiral, you should know that the cadet you've been hosting is not who he appears to be. Agent 17 was placed at this academy for reasons that are now becoming clear. The hegemony's return was not unexpected by certain elements within Alliance intelligence. The tactical displays suddenly shifted to show detailed analyses of the approaching hegemony force that went far beyond what the Academy's sensors should have been capable of providing. Ship classifications, weapon loadouts, and tactical assessments appeared as if Marcus had access to intelligence databases that existed outside normal military channels. The good news, Marcus continued, is that I've been preparing for this moment for 3 years. The bad news is that what comes next will not be pleasant to watch. As the first wave of hegemony missile boats reached weapons range, the Academy's defensive systems responded with precision that seemed almost supernatural. Point defense systems that had never been tested in combat performed with efficiency that suggested extensive practice, and countermeasures deployed with perfect timing to neutralize incoming threats. But Professor Kelmoth noticed that the defensive systems weren't just reacting to the attack, they were anticipating it, responding to threats before they fully developed, as if someone was predicting enemy movements with uncanny accuracy. In the depths of the Academy, in a chamber that officially didn't exist, Marcus Chen stood before banks of equipment that had been waiting in darkness for 3 years. As he began the final preparations for a battle that would determine the fate of thousands, he allowed himself one moment of regret for the peaceful life he was about to leave behind forever. Then Agent 17 took over completely, and Marcus Chen ceased to exist. They teased him for being quiet, until his name showed he was the Reaper, the way. Hidden chamber where Marcus had spent 3 years preparing for this moment was a marvel of concealed technology. Built into the Academy's superstructure during its original construction, the facility had remained invisible to all scans and inspections, powered by a fusion cell that drew no energy from the station's main grid banks of quantum processors hummed with activity as they processed real-time intelligence from sensor networks that extended far beyond the Academy's known capabilities. Holographic displays showed tactical situations across multiple star systems, tracking hegemony movements with precision that suggested surveillance assets positioned throughout enemy territory. At the center of the chamber stood Marcus, but the transformation that had taken place was remarkable. Gone was the quiet cadet who had endured months of ridicule and dismissal. In his place stood a figure that radiated controlled lethality, moving with the fluid efficiency of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of warfare. The equipment surrounding him was equally transformed. What had appeared to be standard Academy maintenance gear was revealed as highly specialized military hardware. Stealth suits that could render the wearer invisible to most sensor types. Weapons that fired projectiles accelerated to near-relativistic speeds. And communication systems that could penetrate any known jamming technology. Ghost Fleet Command, this is Agent 17. Marcus spoke into a communication array that existed outside all official military channels. Confirm readiness status for Operation Dark Mirror. The response came immediately from multiple sources scattered across the galaxy. Ghost 1 through Ghost 12 reporting ready. All assets deployed and standing by for activation. Confirmed. Initiate Phase 1 on my mark. Marcus turned to a tactical display showing the Academy's immediate vicinity. The hegemony missile boats had reached optimal firing range and were beginning their bombardment. The Academy's enhanced defenses were holding, but barely. Within an hour, the concentrated firepower would begin penetrating the station's shields. Mark, Marcus said quietly. Across the galaxy, 12 locations that had seemed completely unremarkable suddenly revealed their true nature. Asteroids that had drifted in empty space for years activated hidden drives and began moving with purpose. Derelict ships that had been dismissed as space junk powered up weapon systems that had been waiting in darkness. Research stations and remote systems shed their peaceful facades and launched military craft that officially didn't exist. The Ghost Fleet had been humanity's ultimate contingency plan, conceived during the darkest days of the First Contact Wars and maintained in secret ever since. 12 fully automated military platforms, each equipped with technology decades ahead of anything in the official Alliance arsenal, positioned throughout known space and waiting for a signal that everyone had hoped would never come. In the Academy's command center, Admiral Thexvar watched his tactical displays with growing confusion as sensor readings began showing impossible events throughout local space. "Sir," Commander Zielneth reported, her tentacles trembling with agitation, "we're detecting massive gravitational anomalies in 7 different systems. Something is moving out there, something big. Hegemony reinforcements?" the Admiral asked. "Negative, sir. The signatures don't match any known vessel types, and they're moving toward hegemony positions. Not Alliance territories." Professor Kelmoth, who had remained in the command center despite orders to evacuate, understood what was happening before the military officers did. She had spent decades studying the history of interspecies warfare, and she recognized the signs of a strategic gambit that went far beyond conventional military thinking. "Admiral," she said quietly, "I believe we're about to witness the return of humanity's true military doctrine." Her words proved prophetic as the first Ghost Fleet assets reached their targets. Hegemony supply convoys that had been moving through supposedly secure space simply vanished, their escort vessels reduced to expanding clouds of plasma before they could send distress signals. Command stations that had been coordinating the Academy assault suddenly went silent, their communications cut by strikes that appeared to come from empty space. In the hidden chamber, Marcus monitored the engagement through sensor networks that provided him with real-time intelligence from across the galaxy. The Ghost Fleet was performing exactly as designed, striking with surgical precision at the logistical and command infrastructure that supported hegemony military operations. But the Academy itself remained under direct assault, and that required a more personal approach. Marcus activated the final piece of equipment he had been hoping he would never need to use. The quantum displacement system was experimental technology that pushed the boundaries of what physics considered possible. It would allow him to appear anywhere within a light-year radius instantaneously, but the energy requirements were enormous, and the system could only be used once. Ghost Fleet Command, this is Agent 17, implementing Phase 2. Maintain current operations until you receive termination codes or until all targets are eliminated. Confirmed, Agent 17. Good hunting. Marcus stepped into the displacement chamber and set coordinates that would place him aboard the Hegemony flagship, the massive dreadnought that was coordinating the Academy assault. As the system powered up, he allowed himself one final look at the monitor showing the Academy's cadet quarters, where 3,000 young beings waited in fear for a battle they didn't understand. Vextar, Zix, Thorak, and all the others who had spent months mocking the quiet human would never know that their survival depended on the very person they had dismissed as weak and worthless. In a way, Marcus preferred it that way. Heroes were supposed to be celebrated, but what he was about to do would not be heroic in any conventional sense. The displacement system activated with a sound like reality tearing, and Marcus vanished from the Academy station. He reappeared in the command center of the Hegemony flagship Dominator, materializing behind the enemy commander, with the silence of a ghost and the inevitability of death itself. The Hegemony crew, focused on their assault preparations, didn't notice the new presence until it was far too late. Supreme Commander Vakthol of the Hegemony Third Fleet had been looking forward to this moment for 15 years. The chance to strike at the heart of Alliance military training, to eliminate the future leaders who might otherwise stand against hegemony expansion, represented both strategic victory and personal revenge for his species' earlier defeat. He never saw the human who appeared behind him like a shadow-given form. Marcus moved through the enemy command center with mechanical precision, eliminating threats in order of their danger to his mission. Communications officers died before they could send warnings. Weapons controllers fell before they could activate internal defenses. Security personnel found themselves facing an opponent who seemed to anticipate their every move. Within 3 minutes, the flagship's command center was silent except for the soft humming of computer systems and the quiet footsteps of a single human operative. Marcus accessed the ship's command systems using interface protocols he had memorized during the first contact wars. Hegemony technology had evolved in the intervening years, but their basic command structures remained similar enough that his old infiltration techniques still worked. The first thing he did was disable the flagship's communication arrays, cutting the ship off from the rest of the Hegemony fleet. Then he began systematically accessing tactical databases, downloading intelligence about hegemony operations throughout the galaxy. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The attack on the Academy was just the beginning of a coordinated campaign designed to retake all the territory the hegemony had lost 15 years ago. They had spent the intervening years rebuilding their military with advanced technology and detailed intelligence about Alliance defensive capabilities. But they had made one crucial mistake in their planning. They had assumed that Agent 17 was dead, that the weapon that had ended the First Contact Wars no longer existed. Marcus activated the ship's internal communication system and spoke in fluent hegemony military dialect. "All vessels, this is Flagship Dominator. Execute Protocol 777 immediately. Repeat, execute Protocol 777. Protocol 777 was the hegemony's emergency withdrawal command, used only when a mission had been completely compromised, and immediate retreat was the only option for survival. Throughout the attacking fleet, ship commanders received the authenticated order and began implementing withdrawal procedures without question. As hegemony vessels started disengaging from their assault on the Academy, Marcus implemented the final phase of his plan. Using the flagship's weapon systems, he began targeting the retreating ships with precise strikes that disabled their hyperspace drives without destroying them completely. Within 20 minutes, the entire hegemony fleet was dead in space, unable to flee and cut off from communication with their command structure. They had gone from hunters to prey in the time it took one human operative to cross the distance between ships. In the Academy's command center, Admiral Thexvar watched the impossible events unfolding on his tactical displays. "Status report," he demanded. "What just happened to the enemy fleet?" "Unknown, sir," Commander Zilnith replied. "The hegemony ships have ceased their attack and appear to be disabled. We're detecting massive system failures throughout their formation." Professor Kelmoth approached the main display, studying the tactical situation with growing understanding. The hegemony fleet hadn't been destroyed by conventional weapons or superior firepower. They had been neutralized with surgical precision that spoke of intimate knowledge of their capabilities and weaknesses. "Admiral," she said quietly, "I believe Agent 17 has completed his mission." As if summoned by her words, Marcus's voice came through the communication system once again. But now there was a weariness in his tone that spoke of battles fought and prices paid. "Academy Control, this is Agent 17. The immediate threat has been neutralized. Hegemony forces in this system are disabled and ready for capture. Ghost Fleet assets continue to engage enemy infrastructure throughout the galaxy. Estimated time to complete hegemony military collapse 72 hours. Admiral Thexvar found his voice. "Agent 17, where are you?" "Aboard the enemy flagship. I'll be coordinating surrender negotiations from here." "Admiral, you should know that this engagement was part of a larger hegemony offensive that has been completely disrupted. The war they wanted to restart is over before it could really begin." The command center fell silent as the implications sank in. The crisis that had threatened to engulf the galaxy in another devastating war had been resolved by a single operative working from the shadows, using assets and capabilities that officially didn't exist. But Professor Kelmoth understood that victory had come at a cost that few would ever comprehend. The quiet cadet who had attended her classes and endured mockery from his fellow students was gone, replaced by a legend that most people would never know had returned to save them all. In the cadet quarters, Vextar and his friends celebrated their survival, never knowing that the human they had dismissed as weak and worthless had just prevented a war that would have consumed billions of lives across the galaxy. And in the empty hidden chamber deep within the Academy, quantum processors continued their silent work, maintaining surveillance networks and defensive systems that would keep watch over a peace that had been preserved by the return of the Reaper. They teased him for being quiet, until his name showed. He was the Reaper. 6 months after the hegemony fleet's surrender, the Galactic Military Academy had returned to something approaching normal operations. The disabled enemy vessels had been towed away for analysis, their crews processed through Alliance prisoner of war protocols, and new security measures implemented. Throughout Alliance space, the official reports credited the Academy's survival to enhanced defensive systems and timely Alliance reinforcements. No mention was made of Agent 17, the Ghost Fleet, or the true nature of humanity's military capabilities. The galaxy continued to believe that the hegemony's second war had ended through conventional military action and diplomatic negotiation. But for those who had witnessed the events firsthand, questions remained. Professor Kelmuth found herself walking through the academy corridors more frequently now, observing the cadets who attended classes and training exercises with renewed normalcy. The young beings from dozens of species seemed unaware of how close they had come to being casualties in a war that would have consumed their futures. She was particularly interested in observing the human cadets, wondering if any of them might be more than they appeared. The revelation that one of their number had been the legendary Agent 17 had changed her perspective on humanity's role in galactic affairs. Marcus, Chen had not returned to the academy. According to official records, Cadet Chen had been granted extended leave for classified reassignment related to ongoing security concerns. His personal quarters had been cleaned out by academy staff, and his few possessions had been forwarded to an address that existed only in Alliance intelligence databases. The other cadets barely noticed his absence. Vextar occasionally made jokes about the quiet human who had disappeared rather than face real military service. But even those comments had become less frequent as new events captured the attention of young minds. Only Professor Kelmuth seemed to remember that Marcus had ever existed at all, and she was beginning to suspect that even her memories were being deliberately obscured by techniques she didn't fully understand. The truth about Agent 17's fate came to her through an unexpected source during a routine meeting of the Academy Council. Admiral Thexvar had called the session to discuss updated curriculum requirements for advanced tactical training, but the conversation had drifted toward recent events and their implications for military education. The hegemony collapse was more complete than we initially realized, Admiral Thexvar reported. Intelligence analysis suggests that their entire military infrastructure was systematically dismantled over a 72-hour period. Command bases, supply depots, research facilities, and communication networks were all neutralized with precision that defies conventional military doctrine. Professor Yiltash, the Malarian xenobiologist, undulated thoughtfully. Such comprehensive destruction would require intimate knowledge of enemy capabilities and extensive pre-positioned assets. The operation must have been planned for years, possibly decades. Or, suggested Professor Kelmuth carefully, it was carried out by someone with previous experience fighting the hegemony. Admiral Thexvar's expression grew troubled. The classified briefings I've received suggest that humanity maintains military capabilities significantly beyond what they've shared with the Alliance. The Ghost Fleet assets that appeared during the crisis were decades ahead of our current technology. Where are those assets now? Asked Commander Zilneth, who had been promoted following her performance during the crisis. Unknown, the Admiral replied. They've vanished as completely as they appeared. Our sensors can't track them, and Alliance intelligence claims no knowledge of their current positions. Professor Kelmuth felt a chill as she realized the implications. Somewhere in the darkness between the stars, automated weapons platforms were maintaining silent watch over galactic civilization, controlled by protocols and procedures that only one human fully understood. Her questions about Marcus's fate were answered 3 days later when she received a personal message through the Academy's communication system. The transmission was encrypted with codes she didn't recognize and delivered through channels that shouldn't have been accessible to civilian personnel. The message was brief and unsigned, but she knew who had sent it. Professor, thank you for your discretion during recent events. Marcus Chen was a good student and I hope his classmates remember him fondly. Agent 17 has other responsibilities now, but he wanted you to know that your xenobiology lectures were among the few things about Academy life that he genuinely enjoyed. The galaxy is safer than it appears, and peace is more fragile than most people realize. Both conditions will continue as long as necessary. A friend. Professor Kelmuth read the message 3 times before the text automatically deleted itself from her communication system. She sat alone in her office for nearly an hour afterward, contemplating the weight of secrets she now carried and the responsibility that came with such knowledge. Meanwhile, in the Academy cafeteria, the daily rhythms of cadet life continued without interruption. Vextar held court at his usual table, regaling younger students with embellished stories about the hegemony attack and his own brave actions during the crisis. The quiet human ran away when things got dangerous, he was saying to a group of first-year cadets. Typical human behavior. They talk about being warriors, but when real fighting starts, they disappear. Zix chimed his agreement, his crystalline form resonating with amusement. I heard he couldn't handle the pressure of real military training. Some species just aren't cut out for the warrior life. Thorak nodded his massive head, his scorched fur rippling with the motion. Good thing the Alliance has real soldiers to depend on. If we had to rely on humans like that one, we'd all be speaking hegemony by now. The younger cadets laughed at the jokes, accepting the older students' assessment without question. None of them noticed the human cadet sitting alone in the corner, a quiet young woman who listened to the conversation with an expression that suggested she might know more about recent events than she was willing to share. Sarah Martinez was the newest human addition to the Academy, having arrived just 2 weeks after Marcus's disappearance. Her academic records were exemplary. Her psychological evaluations showed remarkable stability, and her tactical thinking abilities were rated as exceptional. She was also, Professor Kelmoth had begun to suspect, not quite what she appeared to be. The patterns were too familiar now. The quiet demeanor, the reluctance to socialize, the tendency to remain unnoticed despite exceptional performance. Sarah Martinez showed all the signs of someone who had been trained to blend into institutional environments while maintaining capabilities far beyond those of her apparent peers. But Professor Kelmoth had learned the dangers of curiosity about such matters. Some secrets were meant to remain hidden, and some guardians were best left undisturbed in their silent vigils. In the depths of space, far from any charted star system, a small ship drifted between the galaxies like a ghost seeking rest. Its occupant monitored communication channels and sensor networks that spanned known space, watching for signs of threats that might require his attention. Marcus Chen had aged years in the months since leaving the Academy, though not from the passage of time. The weight of returning to his role as Agent 17 had exacted its cost, reminding him of truths he had tried to forget during his brief time as just another cadet. He was no longer the quiet student who had endured mockery and dismissal from his classmates. That identity had been a carefully constructed fiction, a respite from responsibilities that could never truly be abandoned. Now he was what he had always been, humanity's ultimate weapon, deployed against threats too dangerous for conventional military forces to handle. The quantum communication array beside his command chair activated with an incoming priority transmission. Agent 18 was reporting from her position at the Academy, providing routine updates on security conditions and potential threats to Alliance interests. Situation normal, she reported in coded language that would be meaningless to outside observers. No anomalous activity detected. Academy operations proceeding within acceptable parameters. Acknowledged, Marcus replied. Maintain current assignment until further notice. The transmission ended, leaving Marcus alone with the weight of command and the isolation that came with protecting a galaxy that would never know his name. Somewhere behind him, other human operatives maintained their own silent watches from positions throughout Alliance space, an invisible network of guardians that had been watching over galactic civilization since the end of the First Contact Wars. They were humanity's gift to the galaxy and its curse, ensuring peace through the constant threat of overwhelming violence. The hegemony's attempted return had been crushed, not through heroic battles or inspiring leadership, but through the cold application of superior force by individuals who existed outside normal military structures. It was a system that worked, but only because most people never realized it existed. Back at the Academy, Professor Kelmoth concluded her evening lecture on adaptive camouflage techniques, watching her students file out with the casual confidence of young beings who believed they understood how the universe operated. They would graduate and take their places in the Alliance military, serving honorably and protecting the peace they had inherited. None of them would ever know that their peaceful galaxy was maintained by shadows who moved between the stars, ready to act when conventional forces proved inadequate. They would live their lives believing in the triumph of civilization over chaos, unaware that chaos was held at bay only through the constant vigilance of those who had chosen to become something more and less than human. And in the quiet moments between crises, when the galaxy slept peacefully under stars that no longer held threats, the Guardians would remember what they had given up to preserve that peace and find it worthwhile. The Reaper walked between worlds now, no longer the quiet cadet who had been teased for his silence. But perhaps in the spaces between duties he could still remember what it had felt like to be Marcus Chen, just another student trying to find his place among the stars. It was enough. It had to be enough. Because the galaxy needed its guardians, and guardians needed their secrets, and some prices were worth paying for the chance to preserve something beautiful in a universe that could be unutterably cruel. The watch continued, silent and eternal, keeping faith with the light by embracing the darkness between.